there. Today we are jumping into the purchase contract. So you have had a buyer, you have the buyer's agreement signed, and you've been showing property, and now they are ready to write an offer. Such an exciting time. But there are a whole lot of legalities to any contract, right? So we're going to go through the purchase contract over the next 4 days. Don't get overwhelmed. We'll just take it line by line, paragraph by paragraph, and we'll just explain it, and then you always have the opportunity to reach out with questions. So let's have a look at the contract to purchase real estate. Of course, as with any contract, whether you're listing a property or you're representing a buyer, this line number 1 is one of the most important. This is a legally binding contract. If the terms are not understood or the information is not understood, then advise your client to seek legal advice. Contact an attorney. I usually begin my conversation, this is a legal binding contract. The terms stand as you, as the buyer and the seller, agree. I am not an attorney, but I can help you maneuver through the transaction. So it's just important to have that conversation up front with your client. All right, so when you're ready to write that offer, you put the date here. And if you're filling this out in DocuSign, that date should repeat on every page. So you will have the property address and that date at the top of every page. But when you're doing it electronically, it autofills. So that's a great feature. So you'll put the date in. That would be the day you're writing the offer. Then down here, you put the legal description of the property. As we discussed before, you would find that on the tax bill or the realist program, the legal description and the parcel ID number. So that's where you obtain that information. Not every agent puts that information in the MLS on their listing. As a Keller Williams marquee agent, you certainly do, right? Include that legal description and the parcel ID number in your listings so that it's easy reference for your buyer's agents to find. Obviously, as a buyer's agent, you certainly can go to the realist or the tax records to find that information. But so you would fill in the legal description, fill in the parcel ID number, and then situate it in the county, whether it's Madison, St. Clair, wherever it is. This is an additional, and then you enter in the property address, which this line here is usually sufficient on line 6 for that property address, which means line 7 is extra. You will find this parcel number blank is a bit short for the parcel ID number. These are the 2021 contract documents, and so they've been recently updated. And I know that there have been some tweaks that they're still working out. So hopefully this is one that they'll remedy. So anyway, just fill it in as best you can there with the parcel ID number. Then again, the property address with approximate lot size of blank on line 8. So that property lot size you will find again on the tax records, in the realist report, hopefully on the MLS, but somewhere you've got different references that you can find that information. You can put in the dimensions like 75 by 150. You can put in the acreage, that's usually available on the realist report. If it's like 0.2 or 0.22 or whatever, you could put 0.22 acres. If you are using that decimal, put a 0 out in front of it so somebody isn't thinking that it's 22 acres. So if you utilize that form, some people do the multiplication, if it's 75 by 150, they'll do the 75 times 150 and they'll put whatever that is, square feet. So however you put it there, just identify it for whichever measurement you're using. Mobile home, most properties don't have a mobile home. If it is a mobile home, then you do need to identify it, the model, the ID number. If you don't know how to do that, then come ask somebody. We can help you determine that information, or contact the list agent and ask them. If it's not a mobile home, then put N/A, X's or dashes in these 3 blanks on line 9. Okay, dual agent. We have had some discussion on previous days about dual agency, right? If it's your listing and your seller has agreed that they're okay with dual agency, and now you've brought the buyer and your buyer has also agreed to dual agency, you should have the buyer and seller's initials on the listing agreement and on the buyer's agreement, right? So then you come into this purchase contract. And so both parties have to initial here as the seller and as the buyer that they recognize and approve moving forward in a dual agency situation. This is their confirmation. If you don't have that buyer's agreement with dual agency, or the seller didn't initial the listing agreement to approve dual agency, then you will have to do a confirmation and consent of dual agency form and a dual agency disclosure. So for whichever party, we have to have 2 signatures, 2 sets of initials from the seller and from the buyer in a dual agency situation. So just make sure you have all of those documents in place if it is a dual agency situation. If it's not a dual agency situation, then these stay blank, so they don't need to be completed. And you can't put N/A or X's or whatever in those blanks because they're populated for initials. Okay, now we move down to paragraph 3, offer and acceptance. These terms shall constitute an offer which shall expire, and any earnest money hereinafter defined shall be returned unless the offer is accepted on or before the acceptance deadline. No contract shall exist between the parties unless this contract and all addenda, including counteroffers, are signed by both buyers and sellers. The effective date of the contract shall be the last date that all parties have signed this contract, and all addenda, including counteroffers, if any. So I read that because there's some good information here. So obviously there have to be both buyer and seller signatures in agreement to all terms and all attachments to the contract. It's not a contract until all signatures are in place in agreement. Then the effective date becomes that last date that all the terms were agreed upon. So we dated the contract up here, right? But this is when the offer's presented. Say it was presented on the 5th of the month, but counter offers went back and forth for 3 days. Then the effective date wouldn't be until the 8th of the month when all parties came into agreement. There's sometimes some confusion about that, but the effective date is important when we move further in the contract and we talk about our deadlines for inspections and appraisal and loan commitment and those kind of things. So the effective date, again, is when all parties come into agreement on all terms and all signatures are obtained. All right. The tenancy, no less than 10 days prior to closing, the buyer shall direct how title shall be taken. So the buyer directs that. That's a conversation with the title company, with the lender. So usually we are not involved as realtors in that conversation per se. Definitely you can have that conversation. We need to know who's going to be on title. And sometimes you start out with 2 people on the purchase contract, and the lender or the title company may say, hey, we need that person removed. And you do a contract amendment to remove that person. So that tenancy needs to be established at least 10 days prior to closing. So again, you may have one person signing this contract and have to add a co-signer or co-buyer later. Or you may have 2 people on the purchase contract and need to take one of them off later in the transaction for some reason. So that can be done, and you have time to do that. Okay, paragraph 5, purchase price. In this blank is where you put the purchase price that the buyer is offering to the seller. And of course, hopefully you would have helped your buyer come to a market value, a competitive price for that property according to current market data in regard to the value of that home. So when you do an offer on a property, you don't just want to go off what it's listed for, what's in the MLS, what the tax record says. You do your due diligence as a buyer's agent, and do a CMA for that property prior to helping your buyer write this purchase contract. That will help you and the buyer establish a price. Now, this purchase price is not your choice. It is the buyer's choice. So the buyer will let you know, or you ask the buyer, what would you like to offer for the house? Here is the data. Here are the market statistics. Here is the CMA for the house, determining the value or a value range. That will help your buyer make an educated decision on the purchase price that they're going to offer. Earnest money is not a requirement in the state of Illinois. However, if you present an offer without earnest money, in other words, zero earnest money deposited by the buyer, that communicates a message to the seller that the buyer isn't really invested in the purchase. The earnest money is held in an escrow account, usually the title company that the seller has chosen. So that earnest money is held in escrow as a deposit and is credited to the buyer at closing. So if the buyer says they want to offer $500 earnest money, then that $500 earnest money is exchanged once you have an agreed contract. Once everybody has signed an agreement, then that earnest money is deposited with the title company. So, so you've got your purchase price, your earnest money. As far as how much earnest money, it's been in the state of Illinois, $500 for years. I mean years. Earnest money deposits have not increased with inflation. It's kind of funny to me, but $500 is a typical amount, especially for properties say under $125,000, give or take. Usually buyers do go up to about $1,000 on properties up to $200,000, and then sometimes even as high as $2,500 on more elevated properties. So, but again, that is a term that the buyer chooses to present. It is worth a conversation with your buyer to educate them on how that earnest money is held. That would be cash funds depleted from their account because the title company does deposit it and holds that money until the closing date. Also, another discussion to have with your buyer in this paragraph would be that if for some reason the contract terminates, the buyer and the seller must agree on the release of that earnest money, whether it's divided 50-50 between the buyer and seller, whether it goes all back to the buyer, or whether the seller would keep it. If there's no agreement on that release of earnest money, then the title company or the escrow account holds that money until an agreement is made. And if no agreement is made, eventually that money does get deposited with the state of Illinois. So it would behoove the buyer and the seller to come into an agreement, right? But we'll talk about termination processes and policies and release of earnest money another day. But definitely that is a conversation to have here with your buyer. The earnest money would be delivered. You could put any number of days here. This is business days. Typical is 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. That would be business days after the effective date. So you write the word of the number in this blank on line 25, and you write the number of the days in the parentheses. And then to be held in the escrow account of blank. So you may not know where the seller wants that earnest money held. If some agents put it in the special remarks that the title company earnest money to be deposited with blank title company. And so then you know. So be sure you check the agent remarks on the listing prior to calling the listing agent. If you don't see the information there in MLS, then call or text the listing agent and ask them, where is the earnest money to be held on such and such address? That way you know what information to put in this blank, okay? All right, so moving on down to the home warranty plan. The home warranty contract can be waived by the buyer, or they can choose to have it provided either by the seller or by the buyer. And then you would enter in the company and then the premium amount. So if your buyer wants a home warranty, you definitely want to check provided. Some listings already have it provided by the seller. As a buyer's agent, you want to have the seller, you want to at least present the offer requesting the seller to pay for it. However, in this market, I will say that that could be a deterrent with inventory being so low and multiple offer situations. If the buyer wants a home warranty and it's not in the listing remarks that the seller is providing one, then you may want to mark that the buyer will provide his own home warranty or her own home warranty. The company would be the buyer's choice. They may not have any information. You could encourage them to investigate or research different home warranty companies. We do have pamphlets here in the office, or you can send them Google links. If there's a company that you have worked with consistently, you can definitely recommend that company. But as with anything else, with any other vendors, you never want to just point to one. So you want to provide a choice to the buyer if they are interested in pursuing a home warranty. And then the cost of this would vary depending on the home warranty companies. And you could find out that information on their website or on their pamphlets. But you do want to make sure you add in enough coverage for what the buyer is wanting. So definitely a conversation here, and you need to educate yourself on the home warranty plans. All right, inclusions and exclusions. The inclusions are things that are attached. Obviously, things that are nailed or wired into the property, those would be inclusions. Things that you have to plug in the wall, those aren't inclusions. Those would be excluded unless they are identified in the listing as being included. So anything attached, security systems, the Ring doorbells, the HVAC, ceiling fans, lighting fixtures, anything like that, all of those are attachments. If a mirror has a wire on the back of it or a cord on the back of it and it's hanging on nails, then that is not an attachment. But if the mirror is actually screwed into the wall, that's an attachment. So a lot of questions come up about the TV mounts that are mounted on the wall now. Those are attachments. So if the buyer wants those to stay, well, they should be staying anyway. But it might be worth a discussion with the listing agent to be sure. Sometimes the seller does choose to remove those, and then that becomes a future negotiation. So sometimes those mounts are worth a discussion. Okay, so at the bottom of the page, the seller's, you're the buyer's agent, so your buyers would initial here. We're writing the offer, so there's no seller initials yet. All right, the paragraph here on exclusions, typically that's left no information there. You would put /A, XXX, or dashes. It may be in the event it's in the listing that there's a Ring doorbell present and the seller is excluding that. So then you would write in, Ring doorbell if the buyer agrees to those terms. But typically this is left not applicable to the transaction. The address and the date auto-populate, and we get into the closing and possession. So the closing is when all parties meet at the title company. Everybody signs their documents, and the keys are transferred from the seller to the buyer, and the buyer gains possession on that day. Some people, if they haven't sold a home in the state of Illinois ever or in years, they're a little confused by this. In the state of Illinois, the seller releases possession, the buyer gains possession at the closing table. So once all those documents are signed, funds are transferred, payment is made, keys are transferred, okay? So this date here, this blank here, is the date for the closing. You'll want to push that out to accommodate enough time to accomplish all of the documents, whether it's a cash transaction or a loan. If it's a cash transaction, the title company still needs time to do the title search and present the commitment and prepare the closing statements. So usually you want to provide 10 business days to closing or 2 weeks time if it's a cash transaction. You can close sooner, but that's a conversation you want to have with the title company. What is their availability? would they be able to get this transaction together to the closing table, at a sooner date. So, but generally you want to give about 10 days, 10 business days. If it's a loan, then that would be a conversation with your buyer's lender. Find out when that lender could close the transaction. Some lenders say, hey, we can get it done in 4 weeks. Some lenders say, our underwriting department's really behind, appraisers are behind. This is a grant. We're going to need 8 full weeks. So definitely have that conversation with your lender prior to putting the date into this blank, because that becomes a term of the binding contract, and you don't want to compromise your buyer's position. Sometimes it's worth a conversation with the seller, with the listing agent. Sometimes it may be a unique situation and the sellers need some extra time. It doesn't hurt to call the listing agent and say, hey, my buyers are writing an offer. They could close at such and such a date. Would this accommodate the seller's plans and intentions? Would they want more time or less time? Find out that information if you can. You want to be, especially in this market, you want to be as accommodating to the seller as you can while still protecting your buyer, okay? All right, but again, you don't talk, as the buyer's agent, you don't talk with the seller, you talk with the listing agent. Okay, so moving on down, the seller in this contract, the seller agrees to give the buyer the opportunity to do a final walkthrough prior to closing. So that is in bold because evidently some sellers have not accommodated that term, and it is a term within the contract. All right, so now on line 60, paragraph 9, we move down to the finance contingency. If there's a mortgage on the property, you will have already had a conversation with the lender and what type of loan and what terms for the buyer. You've got all of that information. It may be in their pre-approval letter. It may be just a conversation you've had with the lender, but you absolutely should have that pre-approval in your possession already since you're writing an offer, right? So you would mark mortgage loan. You would put in the loan amount here. If it's an FHA loan amount, it's probably 96.5%. If it's a VA loan, it could be as much as 100%, or USRDA. I always get those initials wrong. Rural development. There, they don't even do the initials anymore. I'm always thinking meat. Anyway, okay, so your loan amount here, again, if it's VA or the rural development, it can be as much as 100%. If it's FHA, usually that's 96.5%. If it's conventional, it could be as high as 95%. It's no longer the 80-20 rule. So definitely have that conversation with the lender. Make sure you know this amount, this percentage, prior to filling out the buyer's purchase contract. The interest rate, some lenders put that on the pre-approval letter, some don't. So have that conversation. This here protects the buyer if the market would crash. They've submitted the offer, they've put in, say, 5% there as far as the cap on the interest rate. Say the market crashes, interest rates spike up to 18% overnight, and the buyer is under contract. Well, this here, if they've got a number here, this is a legal reason to terminate the purchase contract. So if the interest rates spike, the buyer is protected by this term here. Say on the pre-approval letter, or the lender says, yeah, I've got them quoted at an interest rate of 3.8%. You can put 3.8% in here. If, say, when you end up closing or the loan commitment letter has been issued, then the interest rate is reflecting 4.2%. That's okay. The buyer can still close. They would have a legal reason to terminate if they so chose to, but if the buyer is still fine with closing at that interest rate, they certainly can. So I usually try to pad it by a few point percents. So say it's say their pre-approval says 3.8, I might put like 4.5 here. just to pad it a little bit. But again, that has to be a term that your buyer is comfortable with. So that's a discussion. For a term no less than, usually you put in 30 years amortized and then 30 years. Again, another conversation or question for your lender. Seller agrees to pay up to blank of buyer's closing costs. This is a very important conversation with the lender. How much does my buyer need in seller paid concessions for the buyer? The lender may say nothing, they don't need anything. That's a conversation with your buyer. Ask your buyer, do you want to ask the seller to pay any portion of your closing costs? If the lender says, hey, they need up to $5,000, then that's the number you need to write here. Know that whatever number you write here, that will reduce the profitability of the seller on their side. So say you're offering $145,000 for a house, but the buyer is asking $5,000 in closing costs. That knocks the seller's net down to 140, and then their other costs off of that. You know, the seller's still paying commission and title commitment, title insurance costs, and closing costs, and of course paying off their mortgage. So not that you need to be mindful of the seller's expenses, but you know, because you're not representing the seller, you're representing the buyer. So you need to be your buyer's advocate. At the same time, you do need to educate your buyer that this amount comes off the seller's bottom line. So they need to be mindful of that when presenting an offer. Okay, so seller agrees to pay up to, say, $5,000 of the buyer's loan closing costs, prepaid expenses, origination fee, discount points, etc. The pre-approval letter. Ideally, you want to include or attach that pre-approval letter with the offer. I'll qualify that to say, you know, some lenders put the actual address of the property. They may put the purchase price that your buyer is offering on that letter. Or it may just be a blanket, you know, the buyer's pre-approved up to $150,000, but you're offering $145,000. You don't want that seller to know that the buyer is pre-approved for $150,000, right? You got to protect your buyer. So you'll want to ask the lender to just put the dollar amount that you're offering for that property and then attach that pre-approval letter. If you don't have that pre-approval letter, you need to get the offer in. Check the box shall be submitted to the seller and put the date in here. Or I've even sometimes written in upon agreed contract. But you know, depending on the market conditions, in a market like we've been experiencing in 2020, 2021, you want to attach that pre-approval letter. You don't want to wait. Okay, so there is a deadline. If the buyer does not provide that pre-approval letter by that deadline, the seller can present a termination notice. So you want to be aware of that. If you don't get that letter to the listing agent, the seller does have the option to terminate within these guidelines. The buyer must satisfy the balance of the obligations set forth in paragraph 9, finance contingency, within blank days after the effective date or 10 days prior to the closing, whichever date is earlier. So a lot of agents just put n/a or dashes in this blank because it defers to the 10 days prior to closing. This is the loan commitment, the finance contingency. So the lender is ready to say, yes, we can close on this loan. It's just going through final underwriting. It's a loan commitment letter is what it's called. So you can put a date in here. If your closing is in 8 weeks, and you could put in a number of 40 days, you know, really putting in the n/a or x's or dashes is sufficient. If it's an FHA that's closing in 6 weeks, you can put 35 days. It's up to you, and you know, that discussion with your buyer. It's up to your buyer ultimately. Okay. So the finance contingency language allows for obviously termination procedures if the deadlines and the dates aren't met. So you do want to have that conversation with your lender. Of course, once you have an agreed purchase contract, you provide this contract with the lender. So you want to be sure that the lender is aware of all of these deadlines as well. When you scroll down to line 95, this is where you put in the type of financing. So if it's conventional or FHA, rural development, VA, or if there's a grant involved or another type of loan. So if any of those are utilized, then that's the box you mark. Buyer's initials go at the bottom. Okay, so this next page is discussing the different types of financing and what is provided through that financing. So the address and the date go here. This paragraph A discusses FHA rural development mortgage loans. The paragraph B discusses the VA mortgage loan. Those are obviously terms that the buyer and the lender abide by, and some protections that are provided to the buyer through that type of financing. FHA, rural development, VA are government type loans, whereas conventional is not. There is not a paragraph here for conventional financing. Paragraph C is mortgage assumption. Not really typical in our market today. Could happen. Most likely it's the other types of financing we've already discussed. So if that's the case, then you would put N/A or dashes or X's in these blanks. Obviously you can't do that in a checkbox. Purchase money mortgage, that's a special type of financing. That's if you mark the other, and you would indicate that type of, that paragraph D on that other line if that was applicable. Paragraph E is a secondary mortgage loan. Again, not typical. It could be used, but that's a special circumstance. So again, in these blanks, you would put N/A, dashes or X's, and leave these check boxes blank. Buyers would initial here at the bottom of page 3. So that brings us to page 4. We have the address and the date. Those should auto-populate in DocuSign again. Sometimes there's a contract for deed. So you would have marked other at the bottom of page 2 and put in paragraph F for contract for deed. And if it is a contract for deed, then I would counsel you through that. The title company would need to be involved, an attorney or the attorney at the title company or somebody that they would contract out to assist with the contract for deed documents. Just another real estate beast, which we can counsel you through if you have a contract for deed situation. If they're not seeking financing, it's a cash transaction, then you would mark this box. There would be NAs or dashes or X's and all of those other blanks, and you would mark cash transaction. The cash transaction says that obviously the contract is not contingent on financing, but the buyer does have to provide proof of funds to close on or before 20 days after the effective date, but no later than 10 days prior to closing, whichever is earlier. This is another reason why on the closing date you put 10 days, because you have to show proof of financing 10 days prior to closing. So if the buyer fails to provide the proof of funds, then the seller may terminate. So again, utilizing these guidelines. So you want to be sure you know these deadlines. Okay, paragraph 10 talks about the appraisal. If the buyer or lender elects to have an appraisal, such appraisal must be ordered no later than 10 days after the effective date and obtained no later than the finance contingency date. Or if this contract is a cash transaction, as provided in paragraph 9, buyer at buyer's option and expense may obtain an appraisal by a certified or licensed appraiser within 20 days after the effective date. If the appraisal report indicates that the appraised value is not equal to or higher than the purchase price, buyer shall have the option to deliver a copy of the appraisal to the seller within 2 days after it's available to the buyer, requesting adjustment to the purchase price. If seller does not agree to adjust the purchase price down to the appraised value within 5 days after the seller's receipt of the appraisal report, buyer at the buyer's option may terminate the contract by delivery of a termination notice to seller within 2 days following the aforementioned 5-day period. And then there's the termination procedure, which we're going to get into later. So I read that because these deadlines are super important. You need to know them. Take notes, write them down, study this paragraph, and learn those deadlines so that you've got them solid and you're able to communicate them with your buyer, and you remember to follow up with your lender in regard to these deadlines. That is all we're going to cover today. We will jump back in tomorrow and start with the property inspections.